Today I'm going to show you a second grade lesson on how to make a clay clock. We've been studying Surrealism and we looked at the artwork of Salvador Dali. And we're going to start off with just a chunk of clay. And to get started, we're going to change the shape of that clay by squishing it in our hands and then rolling it into a ball. And I like to tell my students to kind of use a magic hand, almost like if you were putting a spell on something. So I'm pushing at the same time that I am moving my hands around in the circle. And as soon as I have a sphere, I want to set that down so I don't dry the clay out. Once I've got it in a sphere, I want to turn it into a patty. And since we're going to make the clock looking like it's melting, you also want it to be a little bit floppy. So to start out making the patty, I put the sphere in my hand and I'm going to smack it 3 times, really hard. 1, 2, 3. Then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to do the same thing. And I'm going to keep flipping that over until it starts to kind of wiggle. And this one's pretty tough. It's not wiggling yet. So I'm going to keep going. And every once in a while I'm kind of checking to see if it's wiggling back and forth. And this one's starting to get a little bit floppy. So I've got a good shape and a good thickness for the clock face. So I'm going to set that down now and wait for the next step. The next step would be to write my name on the back of my clock using the scoring stick. So as clearly as possible, I would write my name into the clay. And I'm just going to write example. I also would write my teacher code. So this is a second grade lesson, so they're going to start with a 2. And they're going to put an S for the first letter of their teacher's name. So I put my name and a 2S. And then make sure that the person next to me can read that. So when it comes out of the kiln, I'm sure to get my clock back. I'm going to start working on the front side of the clock now. So I'm flipping this over. I've gotten out a fork because I'm going to do some scoring. And instead of using the scoring tool, which I could just to make my little scratch marks along the edge, I'm going to go ahead and use a fork just because it makes 4 scratches at a time instead of just 1 at a time. So I turn the fork over and I'm gently scratching just near the edges to get kind of a rough texture because we're going to be like making our own Velcro. We're just going to be sticking a coil around the face of the clock to kind of frame it. So I'm doing gentle scratches, kind of like a cat scratch. I'm not scratching all the way or clawing all the way through the clay. I'm just roughing it up a little bit, kind of giving it a rough texture. And again, I'm just using the fork because it's a little bit quicker than the scoring tool. Either tool would work perfectly fine. So I'm scratch, scratch, scratch. I've got it pretty good around the entire circle now, so I'm going to stop. The next step we're going to do is make a coil to go around the outside of the circle. So I'm going to go ahead and take this chunk of clay and I'm going to give it a good squeeze first. And then I rub my hands together like this, like I'm really cold. And I'm trying to do it slowly so you can see on the screen. But if I was doing this, I'd probably going a little bit faster like this. Then I'm going to put it down. I've kind of got a coil started. And I'm going to stand up and I'm going to use the strength from my shoulders and my hand. And I'm pushing down on the coil as I am rolling it on my table or desk. And it's going to get a little bit bigger and bigger and bigger as you do that. As I was rolling, my coil broke into 2 pieces, and that's okay because I can just pinch those together. You want the coil to be about the thickness of your pinky, not any thicker or it'll take a really long time to dry, and not any thinner or it might fall apart. So I can see it's kind of starting to break here, and that's okay. I can pinch it apart. Now I can use these 3 pieces to use on the outside of my clock face. The next step is to score the coils as well. So I'm going to take the fork again and just make a bunch of little scratches going along one side of my coil. And your coil might be one big long coil. It might be a few little coils like mine are. Either way, I'm going to take the fork and make a bunch of rough marks all the way down the coil. You can do that with a scoring stick or with your fork. My next step is to attach the coil to the face of the clock. So I'm going to take just a tiny bit of water, dip my finger in, and run that right over those scratch marks that I've made on the clock and a little bit down the snake or the coil that I'm going to attach. So I've got water here, water there. I'm taking the rough and making it touch the rough. So on top of the clock, you're going to see a nice smooth coil because the rough is touching the rough. And I'm going to kind of push that down once I have it in place. And now I'm going to do this one as well because I needed a little extra. So I'm going to put that right here. Rough touching rough. I'm going to smooth these together with my finger because they were kind of falling apart. And now I'm going to pinch right here because that's extra. Give a little pinch. And now I can just smooth these together so it looks like it was one coil. So now I've got kind of a border going around the outside of my clay clock. Now I'm just using my finger to kind of smooth away all those extra score marks so people don't see them. And then I will take my scoring tool and up at the top, I'm going to make a hole. I'm going to wiggle it all the way through. And then on the back, I want to make sure that nothing sharp is sticking out. So I'm going to take my finger and I'm going to really make sure that this gets smoothed down so it doesn't cut a wall or cut anybody's finger when it comes out of the kiln. So this is smooth. So I just added the coil going around the face of the clock, and then I added a hole in case I want to hang it on the wall or anywhere else. My next step would be to make the face of the clock, and so what I would do next is take the scoring tool and take the end of it, and right in the middle of my clock I'm going to press down. I'm not going to go all the way through this time, just pressing a little middle for the clock. And now I'm going to go ahead and add the numbers. So up at the top I'm going to put a 12 for o'clock. Over on this side I put a 3 for 15. Down at the bottom I put a 6 for 30. And on the left-hand side, I'm going to put the number 9 for 45. Now that I've got all of the other ones in place, I am going to go ahead and squeeze in the other numbers. So I've got a 12, then I would do a 1 here, and a 2, then a 4, and a 5, and a 7, and an 8, and a 10, and an 11. Now I've got all of the numbers kind of squeezed in, and we're doing surrealism, so if my numbers got a little out of place, or I needed to squeeze them in other places, that is going to be okay, because it's kind of going to be a dreamlike clock anyways, so moving the numbers around would be acceptable. So since I was making a surrealism clock, and right now my clock looks like a realistic clock, I'm going to go ahead and start changing the shape. So I'm going to hold on to it in certain spots, and I'm just going to give it a little push. And I might take it over here and give it a little push, and maybe in here. And I'm just kind of changing the shape of it. So it doesn't look like a perfect oval anymore. It's starting to look like one of Salvador Dali's melted clocks. So I've kind of changed the shape a little bit. And now I have the option of adding the hands of the clock. And I can either add the hands with a coil, or I can add them with my scoring stick. So if I wanted to add them with a coil, I would need to make sure that the coil has scratch marks or tally marks or scoring on the bottom of it. And then I would also need to make sure that wherever I'm going to put the coil, it's got scratch marks on the clock. So I'm scoring on the clock, I've got score marks on the handle, on the hand I'm going to use. So a little tiny bit of water. Now I'm going to attach those two, and that's way too big, so I'm just going to pinch it a little smaller. And maybe even a little smaller than that, so I can fit in the little arrow part. So now I'm going to do that. I'm going to kind of bend this into an arrow. And I can't just squash it on there, even though I'd love to just squash it on. I've got to do the scoring on the bottom of those hands. So I'm going to pick this little arrow up. I'm going to score on the bottom. I'm going to score right around it. And now I'm going to use a tiny bit of water. And now I can squish it down and hope that it will stay in place. The other option again was to just use my scoring stick to draw the time on. And I'm going to kind of fix the number 4 since it got a little bit squished there. And now I'm going to go ahead and add the big hand. So I'm doing 4, maybe it's going to be 450. So that's a little long. So I'm going to pinch here. I'm going to do all my tally marks on the bottom. Score, 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 score. Tiny bit of water. Oops, I forgot. Here I need to score 2 right on the face of the clock. There's the water. Okay, a little bit long. I'm going to pinch that. Now I'm going to bend this to kind of make the arrow again. Score on the back. Score, 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 score. Score here. And now I can just press it down. And now I have the arrows. While I was doing that, I noticed that the middle part where I had the little circle kind of got covered up. So I'm going to fix that just by taking the end of my scoring tool and just pressing back in. And now I've got the hole right in the middle there. It doesn't go all the way through. The hole just goes part way through just to make a little separation of the 2 hands. I'm going to fix my number 10. All right, our class is on to the final step now, and so what their last choice is if they'd like to make their clock and leave it flat, they can. But if they'd like it to be like a melting clock like Salvador Dali's, how they looked floppy, we're going to take a plastic container. It can be a plastic bowl or any kind of plastic. This is just an old yogurt cup, and I've got it flipped upside down. And so the kids are going to be taking their clocks and placing them over the top and then really carefully bending the clock over the plastic mold. And that way, when it dries, it will dry in this melted type of a shape. And when it comes out of the kiln, it'll be frozen like that. So they have the choice of either putting the clock around like this and having it be a melted clock, or leaving it flat and having it look more realistic. This was a 2nd grade clay lesson on how to make a clay clock based on Salvador Dali's Surrealism.